Between 1945 and 1950, thousands of Nazi officers and leaders disappeared from Europe. They were neither captured nor tried. With false documents, Red Cross passports, and help from ecclesiastical networks, they crossed oceans heading to South America. There they found governments willing to protect them, bank accounts ready, and communities that spoke their language. In Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile, those fugitives rebuilt their lives. Some infiltrated industries, others the armed forces in Chile. An isolated German colony functioned as a closed enclave, with hierarchies and punishments inspired by the Old Reich. The money from Nazism, transferred by European banks, financed their survival for decades. How was the largest escape of war criminals of the 20th century organized? What role did the governments and institutions that received them play? To what extent did the dream of a new Reich manage to survive in exile? Twilight of the Reich, the end and the escape. In the final days of April of 1945, when Soviet troops were converging on Berlin and Allied armies were breaching the last German defenses from the west, the Third Reich faced its inevitable extinction. The streets of the capital had turned into cemeteries of rubble. Ministries were burning, archives were systematically destroyed, and military orders barely reached the scattered units. Hitler, secluded in his underground bunker, still delivered speeches about impossible victories, but in the offices of the SD and SS, something different was being plotted. Not the continuation of the war, but survival after it. The military collapse had begun much earlier. Since the defeat at Stalingrad in 1943 and the Allied landing in Normandy in 1944, the German war machine was disintegrating. The Luftwaffe lacked fuel to keep planes in the air. The armament factories, relentlessly bombarded, were producing a fraction of what was necessary. The eastern and western fronts were inexorably closing in on the heart of Germany. In that context, certain leaders understood that the Reich would not rise again in Europe. The question then was not how to win, but how to escape the judgment that would come after the defeat. During the winter of 1945, while millions of refugees fled on icy roads and entire cities were reduced to ruins, a clandestine network began to operate from the shadows of the Nazi apparatus security service officers, Gestapo members, and foreign ministry officials compiled lists of contacts in neutral countries. Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, and Argentina appeared as possible destinations. There was a tacit principle among these men. The Reich could fall as a political structure, but the ideology had to be preserved. This conviction, shared by figures like Walter Schellenberg and Karl Wolff, gave rise to what would later be known as the rat lines, the escape routes to Latin America. The survival mentality dominated the Nazi apparatus in its final days. Some officers began to plan their escape with almost business-like precision. They knew that the post-war world would need experts, engineers, scientists, doctors, and technicians willing to offer their knowledge in exchange for protection. This transactional logic allowed hundreds of Nazis to later integrate into American, Soviet, and South American programs. The Reich Security Service classified its members according to their degree of involvement in war crimes, determining who could reappear abroad with new identities. In Bavaria and Austria, small groups of officers created depots with gold bars, artworks, and false documents. Part of these resources, transported through Switzerland and Italy, would later finance escape routes. The regime no longer believed in military victory, but in a spiritual continuity. The myth that Nazism could be reborn on another continent began to circulate among German diplomats in Rome and Madrid. For some leaders, South America offered what Europe could no longer provide: geographical distance, ideological sympathy, and governments willing to ignore the past. Even before the capitulation, several escape routes were operational. In northern Italy, the SS maintained contacts with members of the Catholic clergy and humanitarian networks that helped war-displaced persons. What began as humanitarian assistance turned into an escape infrastructure. Through monasteries in Genoa, Milan, and Rome, temporary refuge and forged documents were granted to former officers. In Rome, some priests linked to the Vatican managed identity certificates issued by the International Red Cross. documents that did not require exhaustive background checks. With that paper, thousands of fugitives obtained temporary passports and embarked for South America. Simultaneously, in Spain and Portugal, German diplomats and regime sympathizers organized other exit channels. Francisco Franco's dictatorship offered a favorable ground, officially neutral, but ideologically close to fascism. In the ports of Cadiz and Barcelona, shipments of fugitives were documented who, with forged passports, departed for Buenos Aires or Montevideo. Most of the routes ended in 3 destinations: Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile. In those countries, there were consolidated German communities, sympathizers of the regime, and governments that maintained ambiguous relationships with the Allies. The diplomatic connections established before and during the war facilitated the obtaining of visas. When Berlin finally fell in May of 1945, the path was already laid out. On the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. 2 days later, the remnants of his government attempted to negotiate partial surrenders while the city was occupied by Soviet troops. In the following weeks, dozens of Nazi leaders disappeared without a trace. Himmler would be captured and would commit suicide. Müller and Bormann would never be found with certainty. In that chaotic scenario, escapes to the south began. The Allies established occupation zones, but the borders were porous. Austria, Italy, and Switzerland became nerve centers. The monasteries of northern Italy, with religious figures and aid organization officials, prepared displaced persons documents that the Nazis used to assume new identities. Austrian or South Tyrolean names were common, as they easily passed for war refugees. The Italian ports of Genoa and Naples became the main departure points. From there, ships departed for Argentina, Paraguay, Brazil, or Syria. The most important fugitives traveled under new identities, accompanied by families or accomplices who had prepared the ground abroad. In parallel, in Switzerland, a flow of capital from the Reich fed bank accounts intended to finance these clandestine lives. Gold, foreign currency, and artworks confiscated during the war were transferred through intermediaries. Post-war intelligence files revealed that several European financial institutions facilitated the conversion of Nazi assets into neutral funds, later used in South America to establish companies, purchase properties, or finance German communities. The dispersion was total. Thousands of former German army members mingled with the millions of displaced Europeans. For the Allies, the immediate goal was denazification and reconstruction, not systematic prosecution outside of Europe. This temporal gap allowed hundreds of leaders to escape before the borders were closed. While some fled purely for survival, others conceived escape as a strategic move. In the months following the capitulation, in small circles of former officers and diplomats, the possibility of reconstructing the power of the Reich outside of Europe began to be discussed. It was not a formal organization, but an ideal mixing nostalgia, ideological faith, and political calculation. The idea of a Fourth Reich was not based on military conquest, but on the preservation of the race, culture, and National Socialist spirit. The first rumors about a reorganization of Nazism in exile circulated among the Allied intelligence services as early as 1946. Some reports mentioned meetings of former hierarchs in rural areas of Germany and Austria, where the creation of mutual aid networks was discussed. South America, with its geographical distance, its authoritarian governments, and its limited international oversight, appeared as the ideal setting for that revival. The relations established by German diplomats during the 1930s had sown a solid foundation. Argentina, under Juan Domingo Perón, openly showed its sympathy for Germany and its interest in attracting European technicians and scientists. That political and cultural affinity made the country the main destination for the Nazi exodus. Although many fugitives led anonymous lives, others maintained contact with each other. In the German neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, Bariloche, or Córdoba, circles were formed where the situation in Europe was discussed. Funds were raised to help comrades, and symbols of the old regime were maintained. Between 1945 and 1950, it is estimated that between 10,000 and 20,000 Germans linked to Nazism managed to settle in South America. Not all of them were war criminals, but many belonged to the SS, the Gestapo, or had participated in the administration of the Reich. Their arrival coincided with a period of economic expansion and the search for European technicians in the region, which allowed their integration without too much suspicion. The end of the Reich did not mean the end of its influence. Through escape routes, the ideology, funds, and connections of the Third Reich found refuge and continuity. The twilight was not an immediate death, but a slow transformation that would become the symbolic engine of the following years. The Shadow Network, Vatican, Red Cross, and the escape to the south. The defeat of the Third Reich left behind a devastated continent, millions of displaced people, and a tangle of political and religious interests. Amid the chaos, borders blurred, local authorities collapsed, and Allied control spread slowly. In that context of confusion, thousands of Nazis took advantage of the administrative disorder to escape from Europe. But these escapes were not improvised. They were supported by a clandestine network where religious, humanitarian, and political interests converged. The Vatican, the International Red Cross, and dozens of charitable organizations faced an avalanche of refugees. Among them were hiding members of the Nazi regime, the institutions, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem and moved by the logic of Christian charity or emerging anti-communism, became involuntary channels of the most massive escape of the 20th century. After the fall of Germany, the Holy See played an ambiguous role. On one hand, Pope Pius XII sought to maintain the Vatican's neutrality and assist millions of displaced Europeans. On the other, several of his closest officials saw the Nazis as a useful barrier against Soviet expansion. In that ambiguity, a space conducive to escapes was born Alois Hudal, an Austrian bishop and rector of the Pontifical Teutonic Institute of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, was a key figure. Known for his sympathy towards National Socialism, he considered that many German officers were lost Christians who needed to be protected from communist punishment. Using his position, he established contacts with former SS officers and with SD agents, facilitating letters of recommendation and certificates that opened the doors to Red Cross documents. The Italian monasteries, especially in Rome, Genoa, and Milan, served as temporary refuges for German and Croatian fugitives. The clergy, without clearly distinguishing between victims and executioners, offered asylum to those who presented themselves as persecuted Catholics or displaced politicians. Some ecclesiastical superiors, fully aware of the identity of the refugees, argued that helping them was a Christian duty in the face of the risk of their execution or deportation to the Soviet Union. In parallel, the Holy See sought to maintain its influence in post-war Europe. The Vatican feared that the expansion of communism would destroy the continent's Christian structure, and in that context, the protection of former Nazis became a way to preserve a spiritual reserve against Moscow. The other fundamental piece of the escape network was the International Red Cross. Its humanitarian mission to help the millions of displaced Europeans placed it in an ideal position to be exploited by Nazi fugitives. In 1945, the organization began issuing displaced persons' passports, valid for applying for visas in other countries. The process was simple and, in practice, impossible to verify. It was sufficient to present a declaration of identity, a letter from a priest, or a recommendation from some religious institution. In the midst of the post-war chaos, Allied authorities could rarely verify the accuracy of the information. Thus, thousands of Nazis obtained legitimate travel documents under false names. In Rome, Red Cross offices worked alongside church centers refugees from all over Europe, mixed with war criminals posing as simple Austrian or Croatian displaced persons, went there. The officials, overwhelmed and pressured by the urgency to repatriate millions of people, processed the papers quickly and without thorough investigation. By 1947, the system had become an almost automatic machinery. Documents issued by the Red Cross, backed by letters from priests, were accepted by consulates of South American countries seeking European immigrants. In this way, The fugitives could obtain boat passages and escape Europe under a new identity. Italy became the epicenter of the rat lines. The combination of post-war chaos, irregular Allied presence, and strong clerical influence created the perfect scenario. From Rome, Milan, and Genoa, the main escape circuits departed. The protagonists were priests, monks, diplomats, and ex-military personnel who operated under a compartmentalized system to avoid being tracked. In Rome, the monasteries in the Aventine area and the Teutonic churches became discreet refuges. There, figures like Franz Stangl, commander of Treblinka, and Gustav Wagner, sub-officer of Sobibor, hid. The fugitives remained hidden for weeks or months until they obtained documentation and passages. From Genoa, they embarked on cargo or immigration ships bound for South America. Another important route passed through the north of Italy, through Bolzano and the border with Austria. In that region, networks of German and Tyrolean priests operated, facilitating the passage through the mountains and contacts with Red Cross officials. The transit was constant. Each month, dozens of fugitives crossed to Rome with the purpose of embarking. The documents found years later show surprising coordination: lists of names, false identities, letters of recommendation, and even maps of routes. Although the Vatican never officially recognized these activities, the tolerance towards them was evident. The Allies knew about the existence of these channels but prioritized other issues, controlling communism, the reconstruction of Europe, and the political reconfiguration of Italy. The geopolitical context of the post-war period also contributed to the success of the rat lines. In the midst of the formation of Cold War blocs, the United States and Great Britain began to consider many former Nazis as useful assets in the fight against the Soviet Union. Scientists, technicians, and even intelligence agents were recruited for Western programs, while others escaped effortlessly thanks to the indifference of the powers. In the Balkans and in Italy, British and American intelligence services tolerated the escape of anti-communist collaborators, even if they had participated in war crimes. This logic permeated the entire system. Allied agents operating in Rome and Genoa knew that among the refugees there were criminals, but their priority was to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. Some of the most important fugitives had the direct protection of former diplomatic contacts. In Madrid, General Franco's network functioned as another node. Germany had maintained close relations with Spain, and the Spanish secret services helped transfer Nazis to Latin America. Portugal played a similar role, serving as a transit point to Argentina and Brazil. The result was an international network in which religion, espionage, economy, and politics were intertwined. What began as a charity effort for the displaced transformed into a global cover-up operation. The routes ended mainly in Argentina, Paraguay, Chile, and Brazil. In Buenos Aires, Juan Domingo Perón's administration maintained an open-door policy towards Europeans with the purpose of modernizing the population. The Argentine consulates in Rome and Genoa issued visas with relative ease. It was enough to present a Red Cross document and a letter of recommendation. In many cases, the officials themselves knew they were dealing with former German officers, but considered it a benefit. Disciplined, trained, anti-communist men. Thus, figures such as Adolf Eichmann, who obtained his documentation under the name Ricardo Clement, Erich Priebke with the identity of a merchant, and Josef Mengele under a succession of aliases, arrived in South America. Each followed similar routes: ecclesiastical refuge in Italy, Red Cross document, and boarding in Genoa. In Paraguay, Alfredo Stroessner's regime became a subsequent refuge for fugitives. In Chile, the network of German colonies in the south facilitated the integration of numerous former military personnel. The escape network was not only supported by moral or religious help, it also had a considerable economic infrastructure. Part of the Reich's treasure was transferred during the last months of the war to Swiss and Austrian banks. From there it was redistributed to finance the escapes in Rome and Genoa, Intermediaries operated who charged considerable sums for documents and passages. German business connections in South America facilitated the absorption of that capital. Commercial, agricultural, and industrial companies served as fronts to legalize funds coming from Europe. In Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Asunción, companies linked to former officers who presented themselves as immigrant entrepreneurs emerged. By 1950, the rat lines began to be dismantled. The pressure from the Nuremberg trials and international investigations reduced the tolerance towards the escapes. However, by then, thousands of Nazis were already safe in South America, with consolidated identities. Some even maintained contact with each other, creating small social and political networks in exile. The Vatican, faced with growing criticism, officially denied its involvement. The Red Cross reformed its procedures, imposing stricter controls, but the damage was already done. The routes had functioned with almost perfect efficiency for 5 years. Institutional silence allowed the phenomenon to remain hidden for decades, until the journalistic and judicial investigations of the 1970s and 80s began to expose it. The rat lines were not just a set of clandestine routes. They represented a historical transition between two worlds, that of the defeated fascism and that of the nascent Cold War. Through them, thousands of men who had served the Reich found a new role in a global context marked by the fear of communism. The Nazi ideology did not disappear. It adapted, hid, and survived in the shadows of monasteries, in the Italian ports, and in the South American pampas. The Vatican and the Red Cross acted within their own moral logic, but their actions had profound consequences. In the name of charity, impunity was perpetuated. In the name of anti-communism, executioners were protected, and in the name of reconstruction, one of the darkest episodes of the 20th century, was silenced. A southern shelter, Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile under the shadow of the Reich. As Europe tried to rebuild from the ashes, thousands of ex-Nazis crossed the oceans with Red Cross passports and false names. Their destination was not the United States nor Switzerland, but the far south of the American continent, a distant, vast, and politically permeable territory. The choice was not by chance. From before the end of the war, South America had become a place of sympathy towards Germany. The presence of German-speaking communities, the geographical isolation, and the weakness of immigration controls offered the perfect scenario for a new life. The image of the continent as a southern refuge was cemented in 3 countries: Argentina, Paraguay, and Chile. In them, the fugitives found governments willing to receive them, support networks among German colonies, and an atmosphere where the European past could disappear under the sun of the Southern Hemisphere. In 1946, Juan Domingo Perón assumed the presidency of Argentina with a nationalist project that combined industrial modernization, Catholic fervor, and neutralism towards the Allied powers. His government saw European immigration as a means to revitalize the country with skilled labor and reinforce its white and Christian identity. Germany, despite the defeat, remained a symbol of discipline and technology. This perception, coupled with Perón's anti-communism, created a fertile ground for receiving ex-Nazis. Between 1946 and 1950, the country became the main destination of the rat lines. Argentine consulates in Genoa, Rome, and Madrid issued visas to thousands of immigrants under ambiguous identities. Many of them were undercover Nazis, protected by a network of officials, priests, and German businessmen operating with the knowledge of the government. The majority of the fugitives arrived at the port of Genoa, where they boarded regular line ships with documentation issued by the Red Cross. After weeks of traveling, they disembarked in Buenos Aires, where they were received by members of the German community or by local immigration service agents. Between 1946 and 1952, dozens of SS officers, Gestapo, and Nazi army personnel settled in Argentina. Adolf Eichmann, responsible for the logistics of the Holocaust, was one of the most notorious. He arrived in 1950 with a false identity and worked in factories and workshops, protected by the anonymity of the Buenos Aires outskirts. Post-war Argentina had a consolidated German network. Schools, social clubs, banks, and businesses served as cover for the newcomers. In Bariloche, a city nestled between Patagonian lakes and mountains, the German colony had thrived since the early 20th century. Numerous fugitives integrated there, attracted by the alpine landscape and isolation. The German neighborhoods of Córdoba, Misiones, and Buenos Aires offered refuges where no one asked about the past. German entrepreneurs settled in the country, facilitated jobs and housing, engineering workshops, businesses and agricultural companies were established. Some former officers became technical advisors for state or private industries. The network was discreet but effective. They helped each other with money, contacts, and silence. The Peronist government promoted the idea of an Argentina as a refuge of Western civilization. In that vision, the Germans were not criminals, but victims of European chaos. The police apparatus, far from pursuing them, guaranteed their safety. The Argentine intelligence services, partly trained by German instructors, kept files on the newcomers but rarely acted against them. Society, for its part, fluctuated between indifference and admiration. Many saw Germans as exemplary workers. Few knew their past. Thus, the myth of the proper German was consolidated, which hid behind the accent and discipline a history of blood. Paraguay, under the government of General Higinio Morínigo and later Alfredo Stroessner, played a crucial role in the second phase of the Nazi diaspora. Although the country was small and impoverished, its geographical isolation made it an ideal hideout. The border with Argentina and Brazil was extensive and poorly controlled, which facilitated clandestine transit. During the 1940s, Paraguay already housed German colonies established in the Chaco and in agricultural areas in the south. These communities offered refuge to fugitives who crossed from Argentina. With the rise of Stroessner in 1954, protection became systematic. Son of a Bavarian immigrant, Stroessner admired German military discipline and surrounded himself with advisors of German origin under his authoritarian regime. Paraguay became one of the last Nazi sanctuaries in America. The Dr. Joseph Mengele, after his stay in Argentina, took refuge in Paraguay in the 1950s, where he obtained citizenship under the name José Mengele. He lived protected by local authorities and influential German families. Others, like the SS officer Eduard Roschmann, known as the executioner of Riga, also found refuge. The Paraguayan police not only tolerated them, in some cases, they integrated them into their technical or health services. The country became a midpoint for fugitives transiting between Argentina, Brazil, and Bolivia. The absence of extraditions and institutional corruption guaranteed total security. Although officially neutral after the war, Paraguay maintained ties with West Germany. During the 1950s, German companies and banks channeled investments in infrastructure, allowing many former Nazis to reintegrate as technicians or engineers. The Stroessner regime, openly anti-communist, considered these immigrants ideological allies. In return, they offered military experience, technical knowledge, and loyalty based on silence. Chile, although less relevant in number, played a symbolic role in the survival of the Nazi ideology. During the 1930s, the country had received a significant German immigration that contributed to the agricultural and industrial development of the South. After the war, this social fabric provided shelter to fugitives. The Chilean authorities, focused on internal reconstruction, barely supervised European immigration. Some Nazis entered directly from Argentina, others on ships docking in Valparaiso. The most emblematic case was that of Colonia Dignidad, founded in 1961 by Paul Schaefer, a former German army non-commissioned officer accused of sexual abuse in his country. Under the pretext of creating a Christian agricultural community, Schaefer established a closed enclave in the south of Chile near Parral. The colony operated as a totalitarian society. Absolute control of the inhabitants, isolation from the outside, indoctrination, and punishments. Over time, it became a center of operations during the Pinochet dictatorship, serving as a detention and torture camp. Schaefer's links with former Nazi officers and with German and Chilean intelligence services confirmed that the ideology of the Reich had found ideological continuity in the Southern Cone. In addition to Colonia Dignidad, other former Nazis settled in rural areas. Some founded forestry or agricultural companies. Others integrated into universities and technical schools. The German community maintained an almost absolute secrecy. The language, customs, and religion served as a cultural barrier that prevented state intrusion. In that closed environment, the memory of the Reich was preserved through symbols, hymns, and discrete celebrations. The German South American communities were the skeleton on which the Nazi refuge was sustained. Since the 19th century, German settlers had founded towns and settlements in Argentina, Chile, Paraguay, and Brazil. They were cohesive societies, with a strong ethnic identity, their own schools, and transatlantic commercial ties. When the fugitives of the Reich began to arrive, they found a structure already in place: language, religion, customs, and a loyalty that transcended politics. In many of these communities, Nazism had had sympathizers before and during the war. The German clubs organized events with swastika flags and sent donations to the Hitler government. After the defeat, those ties were maintained, albeit in secret. The colonies acted as physical and cultural refugees. Some fugitives posed as distant relatives or hired technicians. The community protected their identity in exchange for work or money. In places like La Falda, Bariloche, Osorno, or Encarnacion, the German accent and Bavarian architecture were part of the landscape, making it impossible to distinguish between the innocent immigrant and the undercover criminal. The South American refuge was not only human, but also financial. During the last few months of the Reich, enormous sums of money, gold, and industrial assets were transferred to accounts in Switzerland and then reintroduced into South America. German-Argentine joint ventures and banks controlled by German capital served to launder those funds. The investments were directed to strategic sectors: mining, transport, energy, and agriculture. In Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Asunción, companies created by former Reich officials operated with neutral names and legal appearance. In some cases, those capitals were linked to international networks of arms and technology smuggling. During the Cold War, certain Western governments looked indulgently at these operations, considering the ex-Nazis as allies against communism. For the majority of fugitives, life in South America was an exercise in reinvention. They changed names, learned Spanish, and built new families. Some thrived. Others lived with constant paranoia, fearing extradition. Social gatherings among Germans were held in closed clubs where military songs were still sung and times of order and greatness were remembered. However, integration was not always peaceful. In some towns, rumors about hidden Nazis fueled curiosity and fear. In others, the indifference was total. The past was buried under the pragmatism of the present. The myth of the Reich in exile remained alive among the refugees themselves. Some dreamed of a return to a purified Germany, others were content with preserving the memory. In the 1960s, the apparent calm began to crack. With the trial of Adolf Eichmann after his capture in Buenos Aires in 1960, the world turned its gaze towards South America. The networks of Nazi hunters, led by Simon Wiesenthal, revealed the magnitude of the refuge. The Latin American governments, pressured by international public opinion, began to collaborate, although unevenly. In Argentina, the capture of Eichmann was seen by many as an affront to national sovereignty. In Paraguay, the extradition requests for Mengele never succeeded. In Chile, the isolation of Colonia Dignidad prevented any serious investigation for decades. Despite the efforts, the majority of the fugitives died free. The Southern Cone was more than a hideout. It was the last chapter of the Third Reich. In the mountains of Córdoba, in the Patagonian lakes, in the forests of southern Chile, and in the colonies of the Paraguayan Chaco, a fragmented version of Nazism survived, a community of men who had lost their country but not their faith in hierarchy and order. Their presence left lasting marks, in the culture of certain communities, in the security structure of some military regimes, and in the collective memory of the continent. South America became, without intending to, the mirror where the world saw, reflected the moral failure of Europe and the persistence of totalitarianism in new forms. Colonia Dignidad, the laboratory of the new Reich. In the late 1950s, in the remote Parral Valley Mall region, an agricultural community began to form that would soon become one of the most enigmatic and dark places in South America. Its founder, Paul Schaefer, a former German army non-commissioned officer and charismatic preacher, had arrived in Chile accompanied by a group of German families that followed him from his native Siegburg, fleeing accusations of child abuse in West Germany. Schaefer found in Chile a politically stable country, deeply Catholic and with a long tradition of German immigration. He presented his project as a humanitarian aid mission, a self-sufficient colony where immigrants could work, pray, and educate their children away from the corruption of the modern world. In 1961, he officially founded Benefactor and Educational Society Dignity on a land of more than 16,000 hectares. What began as a spiritual refuge soon became a totalitarian microstate with its own judicial system, military structure, and internal borders. To the outside, Colonia Dignidad was an exemplary community. In reality, it functioned as a closed dictatorship, modeled after the ideals of the Third Reich. Schaefer represented the archetype of the fanatical survivor of Nazism, charismatic, disciplined, deeply anti-communist, and convinced of German moral supremacy. He had grown up in Hitler's Germany and absorbed its view of hierarchy, purity, and obedience. In Chile, he reconstructed those structures under a new facade: religion. He preached a doctrine that mixed Protestant pietism with militarism, imposing a life of work, silence, and punishment on his followers. His authority was absolute. In Colonia Dignidad, Schaefer was both spiritual leader, military commander, and supreme judge. He divided the community by gender and age. Children were separated from their parents, raised in boarding schools where ideological indoctrination and total submission were practiced. Adults worked from sunrise to sunset in workshops, farms, and hospitals under constant surveillance. Daily life followed a monastic pattern: prayers, marches, hymns in German, physical punishment, and rituals of humiliation. Communications with the outside world were forbidden. The settlers believed they lived on a divine mission, isolated from a corrupt world dominated by communism and moral decay. In the center of the complex, Schaefer maintained a bunker and a network of basements where he exerted psychological and physical control over his community. Colonia Dignidad was built with almost military precision. Surrounded by wire fences, watchtowers, and armed posts, it was completely isolated from the Chilean environment. At the entrance, a gate with inscriptions in German and a booth with guards controlled access. Visitors were greeted with smiles, tours through gardens, and displays of hospitality, but they were never allowed to wander without accompaniment. Behind the facades of Bavarian houses and agricultural workshops lay hidden a complex of tunnels, cells, and underground chambers. The colony had its own hospital, school, sawmill, power plant, and radio station. Everything was self-sufficient. The settlers did not receive money. Their work was an offering to the community. The goods were managed by a council led by Schaefer and a small group of trusted men, mostly ex-military or former members of German paramilitary organizations. The children were educated under a rigid and doctrinaire system. They learned German as the main language and received physical and moral instruction oriented towards obedience. The history of Nazism was reinterpreted. Hitler was not presented as a criminal, but as a leader who had sought the redemption of Germany. The colony's songs, with martial melodies and religious lyrics, reproduced the tones of National Socialism transformed into a mystical creed. From its early years, Colonia Dignidad maintained contact with networks of ex-Nazis established in South America. Schaefer had logistical and financial support from Germans who had arrived in Argentina and Paraguay after the war through intermediaries. He communicated with German communities in Bariloche, Asunción, and São Paulo. Some ex-SS officers visited the colony or sent donations. In Europe, groups of far-right German sympathizers channeled funds under the guise of religious aid. Later archives demonstrated that Schaefer maintained links with members of the Bund Deutscher Jugend and with Western intelligence circles. During the 1960s and 70s, the colony functioned as a meeting point for diplomats and agents seeking discretion. Its location, far from any surveillance, made it a perfect place for covert operations. The underlying ideology remained the same: racial purity, discipline, obedience, and absolute rejection of communism. In its structure, Colonia Dignidad was an echo of the Reich turned into a sect, a social engineering experiment where the principles of totalitarianism were replicated under the guise of faith. The true power of Colonia Dignidad emerged during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. After the military coup of 1973, the enclave openly aligned with the regime. Schaefer offered his facilities to the Chilean intelligence services, particularly to the National Intelligence Directorate. The colony was transformed into a detention, interrogation, and torture center. Political prisoners of the regime were secretly transferred there, disappearing without a trace. The underground tunnels and medical facilities were adapted for confinement and experiments. The settlers, indoctrinated and fearful, followed orders without knowing the fate of the prisoners. In later records, German-made weaponry, communication systems, and a clandestine airfield that allowed the transportation of materials and people were discovered. The agreement with the regime was mutual. The DINA obtained a safe and isolated place for its operations, while Schaefer received political protection and legal privileges. During those years, Colonia Dignidad became a laboratory of repression. German engineers adapted surveillance and radio communication equipment. Doctors from the colony participated in interrogations and drug experiments. The border between religious fanaticism and the repressive machinery of the Chilean state was completely erased. Beyond its political ties, Colonia Dignidad represented a symbolic continuity of the Nazi project. The community was a closed society, racially homogeneous and governed by authoritarian principles. The education promoted the moral superiority of the German people, obedience to the leader, and distrust towards the outside. The hymns sung in community events evoked the military past. The German national festivities remained intact, with parades, uniforms, and flags. The settlers believed they were a spiritual reserve of the lost Europe. The social structure mimicked the hierarchical pyramid of the Reich. At the top, Schaefer. Below, a small group of male leaders. Then, the women and the children, subordinate in every aspect. The indoctrination extended to work. The days were long, the breaks scarce, and the physical punishment frequent. The settlers were convinced that absolute obedience purified them from sin. The fear of expulsion or punishment maintained control. Schaefer used religion as an instrument of psychological submission, presenting himself as a divine spokesperson. During the 1980s, Colonia Dignidad expanded its role within the Chilean military framework. Its facilities housed weapons depots, high-frequency radios, and laboratories. The enclave manufactured its own communication systems, and some intelligence reports revealed that Schaefer offered technological assistance to DINA in matters of interception and encryption. In the records following the return of democracy, arsenals of rifles, grenades, and explosives were found, many of them of German origin. Records of clandestine flights and correspondence with Chilean and foreign military personnel were also discovered. The colony's tunnels were designed as air raid shelters and cells. It is suspected that political prisoners who disappeared were buried in them. Despite excavation efforts, many areas remain unexplored completely. The military structure of the colony was not improvised. Schaefer had recruited former German soldiers and technicians with experience in logistics and weaponry. Security was tight. Uniformed guards patrolled the perimeter and watched the roads with binoculars. With the end of the Pinochet dictatorship in 1990, Colonia Dignidad began to crumble. The first deserters revealed the hidden horror: systematic sexual abuse, labor slavery, punishments, disappearances, and collaboration with secret services. In 1997, Schaefer fled to Argentina, where he lived in hiding until being captured in 2005. He was extradited to Chile and convicted of violations and abuses against minors. He died in prison in 2010 without having revealed the darkest secrets of his enclave. During the judicial investigations, bodies were exhumed, documents were analyzed, and the existence of an international support network was confirmed. The archives showed that Colonia Dignidad had maintained contact with ex-Nazis in South America and Europe, and that part of its financing came from donations by ultra-conservative German organizations. The surviving community changed its name to Villa Baviera, opening its doors to tourism. But the collective trauma remains. Colonia Dignidad was much more than a religious sect. It was the tangible manifestation of the ideological survival of Nazism in the Southern Hemisphere. It represented the continuity of a system based on absolute control, ethnic purity, and obedience to the leader. Today, Colonia Dignidad attempts to present itself as a tourist community, but its history continues to generate investigations and trials. The Chilean state recognizes it as a site of memory, and Germany has admitted its responsibility for not having intervened earlier. Even so, many of the files related to its role during the dictatorship remain classified. The history of Colonia Dignidad synthesizes the paradox of Nazi exile in America. The desire for redemption turned into tyranny, the refuge transformed into prison. It was a laboratory where the ideology of the Reich was reincarnated, mixing religious fanaticism, technology, repression, and economic power. Its existence demonstrates that Nazism did not end with the fall of Berlin, but fragmented into small, autonomous worlds. The guardians of the secret, financial networks, and invisible support. As the Third Reich crumbled in the final months of 1945, in the offices of Berlin and Munich, not only were human escape routes planned, but also the rescue of the economic treasure of the regime. Contrary to the image of total chaos, the high-ranking Nazi officials acted with surprising organization. The SS, the Ministry of Finance, and certain German banks created a system for transferring assets to Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Spain, in the hope of preserving the Reich's funds and employing them in the future reconstruction of a power network. Financial records found after the war reveal that large amounts of gold were secretly transported to the Austrian Alps. Part of that loot was buried or hidden, another part was channeled to Swiss banks under coded names or fictitious companies. The objective was clear: to create a continuity fund. The Nazis knew that defeat was imminent, but they aimed to preserve material and intellectual resources for an eventual resurgence. This strategy became the heart of what decades later would be known as the Nazi financial network in exile, a hidden system that linked European banks, Latin American companies, and influential post-war figures. Switzerland, officially neutral during the war, was the main financial refuge for the retreating Nazism banks, such as the Schweizerische Kreditanstalt. The Union Bank of Switzerland and the Swiss National Bank received deposits from the Reich. The gold arrived in ingots marked with stamps of occupied countries: Belgium, the Netherlands, Austria, or Czechoslovakia. Through intermediaries, it was converted into foreign currency or transferred to private accounts. Liechtenstein, a small principality protected by banking secrecy, served as a transit point for investments in America and Spain. From 1944, while the fronts were collapsing, the SS channeled millions of Swiss francs and dollars into shell companies registered in Vaduz and Zurich. The mechanism was simple and effective. German businessmen created neutral companies, bought shares in South American firms, or deposited funds in institutions controlled by Catholics and conservatives sympathetic to the regime. After 1945, these companies became vehicles to finance the rat lines and the settlement of Nazi exiles in South America. The money did not travel alone in suitcases. It was disguised as agricultural investments, industrial projects, and humanitarian aid. Thus, the Reich's gold was transformed into legitimate capital in the Southern Hemisphere. The regimes of Francisco Franco in Spain and Antonio de Oliveira Salazar in Portugal were key pieces of the financial network. Both countries, officially neutral, offered hospitality to Nazi leaders and facilitated bank transfers disguised as commercial transactions. In Madrid and Lisbon, offices of the former Nazi Ministry of Economy operated, serving as liaison centers between Swiss banks and South American networks. Spanish import and export companies acted as intermediaries to move goods, machinery, and money. Through ports like one such as Cadiz, Vigo and Lisbon, shipments were sent to South America with false or overvalued invoices, concealing the transfer of financial assets. Western intelligence services knew part of these operations, but during the first years of the Cold War, they preferred to ignore them. Franco was an ally against communism, and the ex-Nazis, experts in technology and espionage, proved useful. The financial network was strengthened under that silent complicity. Nazi capital transformed into anti-communist capital. Once established in the Southern Cone, the Nazi fugitives found an ideal ground in Argentina to reinvest their funds. The Peronist government encouraged the arrival of foreign capital without asking about its origin. Argentine banks, especially the German Transatlantic Bank and the Germanic Bank of South America, acted as receivers of deposits transferred from Europe between 1946 and 1955. A steady stream of German investments flowed into textile, metallurgical, chemical, and agricultural industries. Behind many of those companies hid former members of the Reich. In Buenos Aires and Córdoba, companies with bland names emerged, all connected to the same financial network of German origin. The money also served to protect fugitives. Some local lawyers and businessmen managed properties, accounts, and businesses on behalf of the newcomers, while Swiss intermediaries ensured the continuity of the funds. The system operated under three principles: discretion, reciprocity, and silence. In exchange for investments and technical advice, the Argentine state offered security and legitimacy. Paraguay, despite its size, was a key financial node. The regime of Alfredo Stroessner not only provided physical refuge, but also economic shelter. The country lacked strict banking regulation, which allowed for anonymous deposits and uncontrolled money movements. Former Nazis, based in Argentina, transferred funds to Paraguayan banks, where the money was reinvested in agricultural or forestry companies. The porous borders with Brazil and Argentina facilitated the smuggling of goods and currency. German cooperatives were created that exported wood and livestock, but their true purpose was to channel capital coming from Swiss accounts. Some U.S. intelligence reports from the time mention the existence of black funds used to finance anti-communist political activities in the Southern Cone, managed by former Reich officers. Stroessner's Paraguay functioned in practice as a tax haven for exiled Nazism. From there, resources were distributed to ideological and security networks in the region. In Brazil, the process was more diffuse, but just as deep. The German colonies in the south, in states such as Santa Catarina and Rio Grande do Sul, offered cover for agribusiness companies with European capital. Many German engineers and technicians, backed by mixed companies, transferred technology and machinery from the Reich, in some cases recycled from military projects in Chile. The network focused on the trade of heavy machinery and pharmaceuticals. Colonia Dignidad participated indirectly in that system through German intermediaries in Santiago. The community's profits came from agricultural contracts, food production, and industrial workshops. In the 1970s, those resources were combined with funds from Europe to finance its expansion. In both countries, the investments were disguised as technical cooperation projects or development assistance. However, behind the facade of progress lay capitals that had originated from European plunder. Swiss banking secrecy allowed the true extent of Nazi money to remain unknown for decades. The accounts were registered in the name of joint stock companies created expressly to dissolve. Traceability companies in Liechtenstein or Panama owned other firms in Buenos Aires or Asunción, creating an impossible-to-follow entanglement. Some of those companies remained active until the 1980s. Their function was not only to store money, but also to finance ideological projects. Part of the funds went to revisionist publishing houses, neo-Nazi groups in Europe, and cultural foundations in South America. The Reich's money became a global network of political influence, maintained by descendants or sympathizers who never renounced the ideal of a Germanic revival. The role of banks was fundamental. Without their cooperation, the network would have collapsed. Swiss and Austrian bankers acted driven by profit and secrecy, accepting deposits of dubious origin in exchange for commissions. For decades, these funds fueled investments, properties, and fortunes that on the surface seemed respectable. In the midst of the Cold War, former Nazi officers became valuable tools for the West. Their knowledge in espionage, military technology, and anti-communism made them useful to the secret services of the United States and Europe. Organizations like the Gehlen Organization, created by Reinhard Gehlen, worked directly with the CIA and the West German BND. Through these contacts, many ex-Nazis were protected and financed. Some received assistance to establish businesses in South America under the condition of collaborating with information networks about communist movements. The money of the Reich, far from being confiscated, was recycled in the ideological fight against the Soviet Union. In Latin America, Western intelligence services saw German colonies as a resource, anti-communist, disciplined and self-sufficient communities. In this context, Nazi funds found new legitimacy. The criminal past was diluted under the banner of anti-communism. What had been stolen gold was transformed into strategic investment. The concept of guardians of the secret not only refers to bankers or politicians, but also to an entire network of moral and economic cover-up. For decades, the fortunes that originated from Nazi looting were mixed with global capital. German companies that had collaborated with the regime resumed their international operations using South American intermediaries. Silence was the price of stability. Europe needed to rebuild, Latin America to modernize. No one wanted to open the past. Thus, the same resources that had financed the war were later used to sustain industries, banks, and governments. The guardians were not only the ex-Nazis, but also the diplomats, religious figures and businessmen who understood the political value of forgetting. Some of these funds were even reinvested into United Nations development programs or bilateral contracts. No one traced their origin. It was enough for the money to flow. In this way, the economic legacy of the Reich dissolved into the financial fabric of the 20th century, invisible but present. In the 1950s and 60s, while West Germany experienced its economic miracle, billions of marks circulated between Europe and South America. Part of those funds came from the Reich's hidden reserves. The result was paradoxical. Reich money helped build post-war prosperity, disguised as legitimate capital. While monuments were erected to victims in Europe, industries financed by the executioners flourished in the Southern Cone. At the end of the 20th century, the opening of Swiss and American archives began revealing fragments of the system. It was discovered that some of the Nazi gold was still deposited in inactive accounts, and that some companies created in the 1940s still existed as holdings. However, a complete tracking was impossible. Time, deaths, and lack of records erased much of the trail. In South America, many of the companies founded by ex-Nazis fully integrated into national economies. Their descendants continue to operate them without knowledge of the origin of their capitals. The secret survived not only through complicity, but also through merging with the global economic fabric. The Reich, somehow, managed to perpetuate its power through money. The financial networks of the Nazi exile were the invisible backbone of its ideological survival. While the criminal hunters pursued men, the money escaped through legal channels. Unlike the fugitives, the capitals did not leave human traces, only numbers. The guardians of the secret wore no uniforms or insignias. They were bankers, lawyers, and businessmen who understood that impunity could be bought. The gold of the Reich, transformed into investment, allowed the ideology that originated it to remain latent, not as a political project, but as a network of influence and economic power distributed between Europe and Latin America. In that network, money became a silent memory. Each deposit, each hidden account was a relic of the past that continued generating interest long after the Reich had physically disappeared. Antes and Deniers, the counterattack of memory. For more than a decade after the end of the Second World War, the world seemed to forget the thousands of Nazi criminals who had escaped from Europe. The Nuremberg trials marked the symbolic closure of the conflict, but not complete justice. In South America, the echo of the Reich survived without disruption. While Europe was being rebuilt and the powers entered the logic of the Cold War, communities of German exiles thrived in Argentina, Paraguay, Chile, and Brazil. The fugitives married, worked, and built new identities. The local authorities, either complicit or indifferent, merely turned a blind eye. Impunity was the price of collective forgetfulness. But in the mid-1950s, a new generation began to awaken international awareness. The horror of the Holocaust, until then silenced, was emerging in documentaries, belated trials, and personal memoirs. With this awakening also came a movement aimed at hunting down the responsible parties who were still living free, the revenge of memory. During the post-war period, the Allies created endless lists of war criminals. Many were convicted in absentia, others simply disappeared. In the intelligence archives, names began to repeat: Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, Erich Priebke, Klaus Barbie. Their traces were scattered throughout South America, where they lived under false identities, protected by German communities and like-minded governments. As the years went by, the indignation grew. The surviving victims and their descendants demanded justice. Among them emerged figures who dedicated their lives to the pursuit. The most persistent would be Simon Wiesenthal, a survivor of Mauthausen who coordinated an international network of informants from Vienna. Wiesenthal understood that the true battlefield was no longer in the courts, but in memory. While the world forgot, he dedicated himself to remembering. He sent reports to governments, investigated migration documents, and pressured the authorities. Thus began the slow and meticulous process of hunting down oblivion. The most emblematic case was that of Adolf Eichmann, the administrative architect of the Holocaust. After escaping from Germany in 1950 with the help of the Ratlines, he arrived in Buenos Aires under the name Ricardo Clement. He lived in a working-class neighborhood, worked in a factory, and led a modest life, but his neighbors remembered him as a reserved man with a strong German accent. In 1957, Wiesenthal received information about his whereabouts. The news reached Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, which decided to act without waiting for international cooperation. In May of 1960, an Israeli commando kidnapped him in front of his house in the suburb of San Fernando. Eichmann was clandestinely transferred to Israel, where he faced a public trial. His testimony shocked the world. He spoke of the extermination with the coldness of a bureaucrat. His conviction and execution in 1962 marked a turning point. The trial revealed not only the magnitude of the impunity, but also the network of complicity that had protected him. Argentina, humiliated by the Israeli operation on its territory, denied having known his true identity, although the migration files proved otherwise. From then on, the myth of a safe haven for Nazis began to crumble. The other name that symbolizes the perfect escape is that of Josef Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor known for his experiments on prisoners. After passing through Italy, he arrived in Buenos Aires in 1949 with a Red Cross passport. For years he lived comfortably, managing family businesses and traveling freely between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. He frequently changed residence but never left the region. In 1959, the German press began publishing articles about his whereabouts. However, the protection network surrounding him allowed him to escape every time justice approached. He lived his last years in Brazil under the name Wolfgang Gerhard. He drowned in 1979 after an epileptic seizure on Bertioga Beach. His body was not identified until 1985. The myth of Mengele survived beyond his death. His story represented absolute impunity. The doctor of horror who managed to live 3 decades among comfort and fear, protected by the indifference of governments and communities that preferred not to ask. Another example of international complicity was the case of Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. After the war, he worked for the United States intelligence services, who considered him a valuable asset for his experience in fighting communism. In 1951, when his presence became uncomfortable, the North American intelligence network facilitated his escape to South America. He arrived in Bolivia under the name Klaus Altmann and soon integrated into the country's military structure. For decades, Barbie advised Bolivian dictators on repression and counterinsurgency techniques. He participated in the coup of 1980 that established the regime of Luis Garcia Meza and collaborated with drug trafficking and arms trafficking networks. His capture in 1983 revealed the depth of the connections between former Nazis and Latin American dictatorships. Extradited to France, he was sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity. Barbie embodied the mutation of Nazism, from the European totalitarian apparatus to the South American repressive machinery. The cases of Eichmann, Mengele, and Barbie were not exceptions. In Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay, protection networks operated that included diplomats, priests, businessmen, and military personnel. The post-war German embassies, especially those of West Germany, faced a dilemma: collaborate with investigations or protect their citizens. In many cases, they opted for prudence and silence. The ex-Nazis helped each other through cultural associations or German clubs. They shared information, warnings, and contacts in Buenos Aires, Córdoba, and Bariloche. Charitable organizations and schools operated as meeting points. In Paraguay, the most influential German families protected fugitives in exchange for technical advice or financial support. In Chile, Colonia, Dignidad offered temporary refuge to fugitives and maintained communication with similar networks in Argentina. This cover-up structure survived thanks to 2 factors: ideological complicity and money. The fugitives had resources, connections, and allies within local institutions. In practice, many governments preferred their collaboration to their extradition. While the Nazi hunters struggled to expose the truth, a parallel movement of denial and revisionism was quietly growing. In Europe and America, far-right groups began to reinterpret history, minimizing or denying the crimes of the Holocaust in South America. Where many exiles resided, that narrative found fertile ground. In the 1970s, publications and intellectual circles emerged that defended the German version of the war. They argued that the Nuremberg trials had been the victor's revenge and that communism represented a greater evil. Some of these groups received financial support from German companies and foundations linked to descendants of exiles. Their objective was not only to whitewash the past, but to keep alive a collective identity without guilt. In German communities of the Southern Cone, denialism mixed with nostalgia. Generations born in exile grew up listening to distorted versions of history. The crimes were justified as contextual errors, and the perpetrators were seen as men of their time. Memory became an ideological battlefield between documented truth and inherited denial. The capture of Eichmann and the trial of Barbie marked milestones. But the real change occurred in the 1990s, when democratic governments began to review their archives. In Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay, immigration documents and intelligence records were discovered that confirmed the magnitude of the protection network. Judicial investigations reopened old cases. That of Erich Priebke, for example, a former officer responsible for the Ardeatine Caves massacre in Italy who was living openly in Bariloche as a merchant. In 1994, an Italian documentary revealed his identity. He was extradited to Rome and sentenced to life imprisonment. The case shocked Argentina, which had to admit its role in the cover-up. Simultaneously, the international press re-examined the relationship between ex-Nazis and Latin American dictatorships. Reports on Colonia Dignidad, financial ties, and covert operations exposed a network of decades. The myth of the idyllic refuge transformed into a symbol of global impunity of the 20th century. Unlike the pioneers, the new Nazi hunters worked with files, databases, and judicial cooperation institutions like the Simon Wiesenthal Center. German prosecutors and human rights organizations undertook transnational investigations. The years were no longer an excuse. Even if the criminals were elderly, justice had to reach them. In parallel, initiatives emerged in Latin America to rescue the memory of the victims. In Buenos Aires, Asunción, and Santiago, exhibitions and educational projects were created that linked European history with local dictatorships. The figure of the hidden Nazi became a metaphor for the power that hides behind the silence. Justice was late, but symbolic. Each capture and each trial represented a moral victory over indifference. In them, more than individuals were judged. A system of impunity built on the complicity of the free world was condemned. However, while the trials advanced, revisionism transformed into modern political discourse. At the turn of the century, the Internet amplified conspiracy theories and denial movements. From Europe to South America, websites and forums emerged that portrayed Nazism as a model of order and attacked the validity of the Holocaust. In Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, small neo-Nazi groups began to use Reich symbols mixed with local nationalism. In some cases, descendants of exiles defended the memory of their ancestors, arguing that they had been victims of Allied propaganda. Denial became a psychological refuge for the generations born from exile, a way to justify the family silence. In response to this phenomenon, educational institutions and memory museums intensified their work. The challenge was no longer to capture the culprits, but to preserve the historical truth in the face of digital distortion. The hunt for Nazis in South America was more than a judicial operation. It was an act of moral reconstruction. Each trial, each testimony, and each discovery served to restore the victim's voice. In a continent accustomed to forgetting, that memory had a double effect. It recalled the European horror and reflected the local dictatorships themselves. The trials against Eichmann, Priebke, and Barbie showed the world that justice could be delayed but not impossible. They also exposed the responsibility of the societies that had given refuge, revealing the thin line between hospitality and complicity. The process of memory transformed the meaning of South American refuge from a paradise for fugitives to a stage of moral surrender. The continent that had welcomed the executioners became, decades later, a space of truth and reconciliation. The hunters and the deniers represent two opposing forces of the 20th century. While some pursued the truth, others sought to erase it. Between both extremes, the struggle for memory developed, a battle that continues to this day. South America was its symbolic field, the place where the Reich attempted to be reborn and where it was finally confronted. The capture of Eichmann, the fall of Colonia Dignidad, the late trials, and the opening of archives demonstrated that no crime can ever be buried forever. History not only belongs to the victors, but to those who insist on remembering it. In that insistence lives true justice. The echo of the Fourth Reich: heritage, ideology, and legacy. The end of the Second World War did not end Nazism, it displaced it. Its armies were defeated, its state structure demolished, but its ideology found refuge in the diaspora. In South America, this displacement took on a particular form, the conversion of political totalitarianism into a culture of silence and nostalgia. The fugitives of the Reich arrived on the continent as scattered individuals, but within them they retained the same worldview: hierarchy, purity, discipline, anti-communism, and distrust toward democratic modernity. During the following decades, those principles survived within closed communities, German schools, cultural circles, and families, where official history was replaced by an alternative narrative. Many of the young people were educated in German schools managed by communities that had received financial support from abroad. In the classrooms, Germany's history was taught in a softened manner. Economic reconstruction was emphasized, but genocide was omitted. Nazism became a tragic stage, not a crime. Thus, the cultural transmission of forgetting was shaped. The result was a second generation marked by ambivalence, proud of their German heritage but unable to confront their history. In places like Bariloche, Osorno, Encarnacion or Blumenau, German identity remained strong, wrapped in a cloak of discretion. Silence was a form of protection, but also of denial. At the end of the 1970s, while Western Europe was facing the rise of young neo-Nazi groups, South America was experiencing its own version, more dispersed but equally laden with resentment. The combination of military dictatorships, economic crisis, and political polarization offered the perfect ground for the resurgence of authoritarian symbols and rhetoric. In Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Paraguay, small organizations appeared that reproduced the imagery of the Reich, uniforms, runic symbolism, and exaltation of order. Some of their founders were direct descendants of exiles or sympathizers of the ideology. Others simply saw in Nazism a symbol of rebellion and strength. The phenomenon was not massive, but it was persistent. During the dictatorships of the 70s, the ideological coincidences were evident: anti-communism, systematic repression, and the conception of the enemy as subhuman. Although the South American regimes were not Nazis in a doctrinal sense, they shared the logic of the internal enemy and the use of terror as a tool of control. The presence of German advisors, including some former Nazis, reinforced that symbolic link. In Chile, the DINA maintained relations with members of Colonia Dignidad. In Paraguay, Stroessner used racialist rhetoric in his propaganda. In Argentina, some military personnel openly admired the efficiency of the German army. The echo of the Reich seeped into the speeches, in the aesthetics and in the forms of power. After the fall of the dictatorships, the former supporters of the Reich reorganized into cultural associations and German memory centers. On the surface, they promoted music, gastronomy, and traditions. In their inner circles, revisionist texts, biographies of Nazi leaders, and denial material circulated. In the 1990s, with the advent of the Internet, these networks became international. From Argentina and Chile, digital bulletins were edited that spread conspiracy theories about the Holocaust and exalted figures of Nazism. The Fourth Reich transformed into a mystical concept, a spiritual revolution that would be reborn when the West fell into moral decay. These ideas found resonance among ultranationalist sectors and disenchanted youth groups. In some cases, Nazi symbolism mixed with local elements. The condor, the Incan sun, or the Chilean flag merged with the swastika in graffiti and pamphlets. The message was always the same: order, race, identity, and rejection of modernity. In the German communities of the Southern Cone, the new generations began to slowly uncover the truth. From the 2000s, children and grandchildren of exiles embarked on personal investigations into the family past. Some found records of the SS, photographs of concentration camps, letters signed with false names. That discovery produced an internal fracture between cultural pride and historical shame. Documentaries, novels, and testimonies began to reveal what had been taboo for decades in Bariloche. Descendants of fugitives publicly acknowledged their grandparents' complicity. In Chile, former colonists of Colonia Dignidad shared their experiences of indoctrination. In Paraguay, journalists tracked down migration records showing the massive influx of Germans after 1945. Individual memory transformed into collective memory. The children of exile broke the pact of silence, but the symbolic weight of the past remained present. For many, the Fourth Reich was no longer a political project, but an inherited wound, the awareness of having grown up on the foundations of horror. In the last decades of the 20th century, the German government began to face its responsibility in the involuntary protection of ex-Nazis abroad. For years, West Germany had prioritized political stability over judicial prosecution. Many fugitives retained valid passports or received state pensions. Only with the pressure of human rights organizations and the work of Nazi hunters did Berlin accept the magnitude of the problem. Germany funded judicial cooperation missions with Argentina, Chile, and Paraguay, helping to identify former members of the Reich still alive. It also promoted historical memory programs in the former German communities. However, many of those responsible died before being tried. The judicial legacy was limited, but the symbolic one was immense. The acceptance that Nazism did not end with the war, but persisted in the diaspora. In the 21st century, Nazism stopped being an underground ideology to become a global digital phenomenon. In South America, neo-Nazi groups resurged strongly following the economic crisis and political radicalization. In Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, youth organizations adopted Hitlerian symbols combined with modern nationalist discourses, hatred of immigrants, body worship, nostalgia for order and purity. Social networks amplified their reach. Websites and video channels spread revisionist propaganda, mixing historical denialism with conspiracy theories about globalism and cultural degeneration. The myth of the Fourth Reich transformed into an apocalyptic narrative, the return of a white elite destined to save the world from decadence. In some sectors, this discourse merged with esoteric or pseudo-religious movements. Nazism ceased to be a policy and became a mythology of purity and redemption, able to adapt to new generations without a uniform, but with the same language of hate. In the face of this resurgence, governments and civil society undertook a work of memory. Museums, archives, and cultural centers transformed old refuges into places of reflection. In Chile, Villa Baviera became a site of memory, with guided tours that explain the history of the community and its crimes. In Argentina, the Buenos Aires Holocaust Museum expanded its focus to include the history of Nazi fugitives and their integration into the country. In Paraguay, academic institutions began to investigate the links between Stroessner and the German networks. These efforts seek to break the heritage of silence, replacing shame with knowledge. One of the most subtle aspects of the Nazi legacy in South America is its conversion into aesthetics. The Bavarian architecture of Bariloche, the German colonies in southern Chile, beer festivals or Germanic clubs are part of the cultural landscape. But beneath that normality subsists an imaginary of order, cleanliness, and hierarchy inherited from the past. In some cases, that aesthetic is unconsciously associated with values of discipline and superiority. The line between cultural pride and ideological heritage is blurred. The tourist fascination with the German towns of the Southern Cone often ignores their historical origin. Colonies founded or repopulated by fugitives from the Reich. The visual culture of Nazism reappears in popular contexts, stripped of its political content but still laden with symbolic power. Thus, the echo of the Fourth Reich survives not as a political program, but as an aesthetic memory, a cultural shadow that repeats itself unknowingly. Despite historical evidence, the myth of the hidden Reich persists. In the popular imagination, especially in conspiratorial sectors, it is believed that some Nazi hierarchs survived and organized from South America a secret network destined to resurrect German power. Books, movies, and pseudo-historical theories have fed that fantasy. Submarines sunk in Patagonia, bases in Antarctica, treasures buried in the Andes. Although without real foundation, these stories reflect a deeper phenomenon, the need to explain the persistence of evil through myth. The Fourth Reich does not exist as an organization, but it does as a symbol of continuity. It represents the fear that fascism will never disappear, only change form. The reality, more complex, shows that the Reich survived in fragments, in bank accounts, in closed communities, in ideas transmitted without a name. Its power was not that of weapons, but that of deformed memory. The journey of the Nazi fugitives and their ideological heirs turns the South American continent into a mirror of Europe. Here, the same dilemmas were repeated. justice or impunity, memory or denial, progress or silence. Each country faced its own reflection. Argentina with its shelters, Chile with Colonia Dignidad, Paraguay with Stroessner, Brazil with its southern colonies. The Fourth Reich was a metaphor of continuity, but also a warning. It demonstrated that totalitarian ideologies do not disappear. They transform and adapt to the environment. South America, with its mix of welcome and amnesia, allowed observing how the European past could reproduce on a continental scale. Today, almost 100 years after the rise of Nazism, its shadow is still perceived in the Southern Cone. In extremist speeches, in closed communities, in the trivial use of its symbols or in collective forgetfulness, the echo of the Fourth Reich does not resonate in marches or parades, but in the cracks of history, in every attempt to deny the horror or justify authoritarianism. But there is also the opposite echo, the memory that refuses to forget. In the trials, the memorials, and the voices that narrate, the truth persists as a response. The myth of the Reich survived, but so did its moral defeat. The continent that once served as a refuge has become a guardian of the warning. No empire of hate ever completely dies unless it is remembered with all its darkness.